Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Microbiome series with me, Chef Jess, and Dr. Katrina Whiteson. We will be discussing carbs and glucose. Oh, sorry, carbs today and blood sugar. And so, without further ado, just because it's a long, we got a lot of cool stuff to share with you. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Katrina Whiteson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Today's lecture about understanding the microbiome from our series will focus on carbs and blood glucose. And I've chosen this loaf of sourdough bread that my husband baked recently as an icon of carbohydrates. And I also just want to mention on a personal note, I have had type 1 diabetes for almost 40 years. This year will be the 40th anniversary. I was 6 when I was diagnosed. And so half of my brain at all times is managing my blood sugar. And I've got my continuous glucose monitor here, and so I have I'd like to share with you how I do this and what I know about carbohydrates and insulin that allows me to balance this and keep myself going. So again, I'm Katrina Whiteson. I'm in the biochemistry department here at UCI, and I'm the co-director of our microbiome center. Speaking of bread, I have a favorite story here to share with you where, so this is at the intersection of carbohydrates, microbiome, and blood sugar control. So when people eat different kinds of bread, it affects their blood sugar in different ways. And this study really illustrates that. In this study, they gave people either sourdough bread or white bread. Now, you might instantly expect that everyone who got the white bread had a bigger spike in blood sugar, and everybody who got the sourdough bread had a more balanced and slower response to the sourdough bread affecting their blood sugar. But in actuality, it turns out to be much more complex, and people have individual responses. So some people had a bigger spike in blood glucose when they ate white bread, and other people had a bigger spike in glucose when they ate sourdough bread. And that correlated with the microbes that were found in their gut at the time of the study. So this to me illustrates the puzzle we're about to explore, which is how do you eat in a way that keeps you healthy and avoids big spikes in blood sugar, which lead to large use of insulin and essentially getting you on the road to insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. So this is just one favorite study, but first I want to get us back to basics so you can learn more about this. So as I've told you guys in previous lectures, if you've been coming to this series, I'm a microbiome scientist, and my lab has been doing high fiber diet interventions in undergraduate classes. I actually have one going right now in the winter quarter. We're going to start the intervention in 2 weeks. And I have 60 students enrolled, and the class looks a lot like this one. And and in fact, I can invite participants, send me an email if you're interested. If you're a UCI student, staff, or faculty, you're eligible to participate. And so anyway, in this study, we asked the students to eat 40 grams of fiber for 2 weeks, and we studied their microbiome before and after, and we've been publishing both science and education-related papers. Okay, so if we're going to talk about carbohydrates today, we got to start with sugar. Now, not all carbs are sweet, which is really fascinating, I think, but sugar is definitely sweet. And our consumption of sugar, which is pure carbohydrate, has just skyrocketed in the last couple of 100 years. So in this funny analysis, they predict that the United States diet will be 100% sugar by the year 2060 or something like that, if we keep going at the rate we've been going. Other interesting tidbits are that 300 years ago, it took us a year to eat the amount of sugar that we eat in a day today. And another favorite way to look at this is that, centuries ago, the queen in a castle used to have a key to the room where the sugar was stored, and it was a super precious commodity and used very sparingly. Now, of course, that's not the world we're in today. We're in a world where we eat processed food, where most of the fiber has been removed. And so if you've been coming to my lecture series and came to my fiber lecture, you learned that there's this fiber gap where in the United States and in many parts of the industrialized world, we're eating half or less of the fiber that we need to promote health and avoid blood sugar spikes and to feed our gut microbiome. Okay, so when I say sugar and carbohydrates, what do I mean? Well, there's monosaccharides, which are individual sugar molecules um, that include glucose, fructose, and galactose. Glucose is what we're talking about when we say blood sugar, we really mean blood glucose. So this is a fundamental unit that feeds into a lot of our metabolic pathways, and it's just one of these 6 carbon circle chains that's depicted in this cartoon. And if you want to hear more about this, there's a YouTube video here linked that I really appreciated from the TED series. Now, when we say sugar, we're actually, in many cases, like that teaspoon of sugar I just showed you, that's sucrose. Sucrose is not just one monosaccharide, it's actually 2, it's a disaccharide. So sucrose is down here, you see it's a glucose and a fructose linked together, and that's what gives us our sweet sucrose. Lactose, for example, is another disaccharide that's in milk, but it doesn't taste sweet to us. So it's interesting, it'll affect blood glucose kind of quickly, actually. As a type 1 diabetic, I use milk to treat blood sugar, low blood sugar, and it's like a really great quick source of glucose. But I always find it so ironic when I'm doing that because I'm not really tasting the sweetness. In fact, if you buy milk that's free of lactose, I think it actually tastes sweeter. So that's kind of funny. Anyway, so those are the simple carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates can get really complicated. In fact, they are super understudied, and you could even call fiber the dark matter of the nutritional world because we often don't know very much about the way that the fibers that we eat are constructed. When you look at a nutrition label, you get detailed information about some molecules like vitamin C, but for carbohydrates, it's just one big black box, even though there's a ton of unique molecules underneath that label. Um, so oligosaccharides are 3 to 10 linked sugars, and then polysaccharides are 10 or more linked sugars, and that will comprise what we think of as starch, which are accessible to human digestion. So the linkages between the sugars and starch are something that human enzymes can get to, so we can get energy from starch quickly. Fiber, on the other hand, the linkages that are building up fiber are not accessible by human enzymes. So when we eat fiber, it stays in our digestive tract and makes it all the way down to the colon where the microbes live, which you've learned in my previous lectures. So fiber cannot be turned into sugar that affects our blood glucose with the help of only human enzymes. The only way we can break it down actually is if our microbes help. So starch can affect our blood sugars, and our human enzymes can break these linkages down. So it's not about the number of sugars linked together, it's also about the kind of linkages. The chemistry for the fiber linkages is inaccessible by human enzymes. And then glycogen is a last one. Glycogen are big chains of glucose, and that's the way that glucose is stored in our muscles and in our liver. So that's a very important reserve that gets mobilized when you exercise, for example. So in our world, we are eating lots of starch. Those are the chains of glucoses and sugars that our human enzymes can break down and can affect our blood sugar. And we've usually removed the fiber from a lot of the foods that we're eating these days. So we're getting lots of starch. We're not getting so much fiber in the way that many people are eating these days. And that's a big part of how we've ended up with this big increase in obesity, metabolic disease, and type 2 diabetes. Now, diabetes often gets lumped into this one term, diabetes, as if it's just all the same thing. And I've told you I have a personal connection here, so I'm going to really hope to have you leave this lecture with a lot of clarity on that point. So diabetes was actually first described in antiquity. People have had a lot of different strategies for noticing an energy wasting disease where people had sugar in their urine. People had interesting strategies for diagnosis before we had molecular tests. For example, in India, they would put out urine and see if ants were attracted to it. And In other parts of the world, medical professionals from that era would taste the urine and notice if it was sweet. The words for diabetes mellitus were coined by this Greek icon from Cappadocia, and diabetes refers to excessive urine, and mellitus refers to honey. So sweet urine is where the name came from. So there was a long period of time where, especially for children who were developing autoimmune diabetes, it was a death sentence and they would waste away. And the only strategies we had were to give low carbohydrate diets. So, like asking children to eat mostly cabbage and eggs and vegetables that were low in carbohydrates. And then that would kind of prolong the period that they could survive with what little insulin their body was making until it totally stopped making insulin. Um, the discovery of insulin took place in Canada at the University of Toronto in 1921 by this team of doctors Banting and Best who won the Nobel Prize. And I'm going to have to stop myself from telling too many stories, but there's great stories about this and books that have been written. And there's a museum you can visit to find out all about this whole experience where they discovered a pancreatic extract that was actually helping to reduce the sugar in the urine and helping people be able to get energy from their food. So basically, before the discovery of insulin, these are examples of children. This is a child before and after she was given access to insulin right around the time of its discovery. So if you have no insulin, you can't get glucose into your cells. So your blood will be drowning in sugar. You can eat all you want, but you can't access the energy. And so your muscles and fat cells, they need insulin to call up the glucose transporters and let the food in. So you will just drown in sugar in your blood while wasting away, as you see with this child before she got insulin. Now, here's a few weeks later, after she was able to, or maybe it's months, after she started getting insulin treatments in 1922. And here's a book telling the story. There's a lot of inspiring stories from this era that really make me have a lot of confidence in the capacity for science to help humans. This is such a great story about a clinic where there was a whole ward of children who were wasting away with type 1 diabetes. And they walked in, this team of doctors and scientists and nurses, and they started to give insulin to the children. Many of them were in a coma and were not likely to survive much longer. And then one by one, the children woke up and their parents were there. And it just became a really amazing scene of joy and hope as they describe here. And actually, at this time, children with type 1 diabetes were often living in hospitals because it was hard to access the insulin. And my own life was really affected by the doctors from this era. Some of them started summer camps where they would take all the children from those diabetes wards up to the mountains because they weren't really so sick. They couldn't enjoy the mountains. They just needed a lot of medical care. And I got to go to a camp up in Kings Canyon National Park called Bearskin, which had a huge influence on my life. I have so much gratitude to the doctors who started that camp. And anyway, so that's the story of when insulin was discovered. And at first, we had to find a way to access it. I mean, this is life or death for people. And now we're really good at making enormous amounts of insulin. In fact, most of the insulin people are taking these days is human insulin. I can show you my own jar if Zoom will let me, maybe not. So there's a jar of human insulin that was fermented in a facility like this one. So we are able to supply the world with insulin these days. And it's not just for type 1 diabetes. In fact, type 1 autoimmune diabetes, like I have, is the less common form. And so, you know, in a healthy state, you've got insulin letting sugar into your cells. In the context of type 1 diabetes, your immune system kills the cells that make insulin. So there is no insulin, so you're flooded in sugar and can't get the glucose in. And then in type 2 diabetes, you actually often make lots of insulin, but it's not effective. We call that insulin resistance. So people can't use the insulin even though they're making it. So it's a really different problem. A lot of the treatments are all about making the insulin you have more effective or exercising to make the insulin you have more effective. So as I mentioned, we've got two main types of diabetes here. There is type 1 diabetes, which is probably about 5% of all diagnosed diabetes. It's usually diagnosed in children or now people under 40. It used to be called juvenile diabetes. And for type 1 diabetes, you need insulin or you'll die within a week or something like that. It's absolutely essential to survival. With type 2 diabetes, it's much more common. It's often diagnosed after the age of 40. And sometimes people do become insulin dependent, but in some stages of the disease, you can use diet and exercise and other medicines that make the insulin you do have effective. So it's a really different type of strategy. I think just as a public health message, I've got an audience here who I think could really benefit, I hope, from just knowing this. Knowing the early stages of type 1 diabetes could save someone's life. We still have children who are, thought to just have the flu or something and they die because they're not diagnosed in time. So knowing the signs, people tend to pee a ton, like drinking tons of water and peeing gallons of it out. All that sugar pulls the urine out of you and they get really tired and lose a lot of weight. So those are kind of the main symptoms of type 1 diabetes. For many years, the main strategy for treating diabetes involved injections of insulin, like in a kit like this one, and then finger poke blood sugar measurements. And your goal is to keep your blood sugar within these ranges. In the US, we use milligrams per deciliter as the units. And so, you're trying to keep it between 80 and 100 for a non-diabetic, but that's basically not possible with type 1 diabetes because there's so many things affecting blood sugar. But here's an example of, this would be super idealized for a non-diabetic, but, your goal is that your blood sugars are staying in these normal ranges with some deviation and increase after meals. These days, a lot of us use insulin pumps. So this is a little pump, like a cartridge of insulin with a pump behind it. So you can program the amount of insulin you get each hour, and then also give bigger chunks of insulin when you eat. So you have a little infusion set at your skin. That makes the kinetics really complicated. So a person without diabetes, their insulin is delivered by their pancreas to the perfect spot, right by the portal vein of the small intestine. So as the food comes out, the insulin's right there. If you're delivering the insulin at the top of your skin, it's got to diffuse, you got to wait an hour. So that kind of slows things down. And then another thing I want to emphasize is that this is just a complicated syringe. The brain behind the operation is still the person controlling the pump. So this does not mean like, oh, my pump is just doing everything for me. I mean, people with diabetes are spending half their brain energy on like figuring out how much insulin to take all the time. About half of it per day is basal to just keep you going throughout the day. And then the other half is what we call boluses, chunks of insulin you take in response to meals or other deviations, like if you're sick or stressed, you might need extra insulin. These days, we also have continuous glucose monitors, which are really becoming more prevalent in a wonderful way. I see so many companies offering this, and you can learn a lot. This must be a non-diabetic or not a type 1 diabetic or somebody who eats a very low carbohydrate diet because you can see their blood sugar is really staying in the range the whole time. But you just wear a little patch like that, usually on your arm, and there's a little glucose sensing probe that's in the interstitial fluid, sending messages via Bluetooth to your phone. So that means that before we would do finger sticks, like these red dots in this plot, and you wouldn't see what was going on all the time. You could end up missing really important signals. Now we have good information through time about what's happening after meals and when you're exercising and so on. And actually, there are some pumps now that can communicate with the continuous glucose monitors. And there's very limited, but a bit of help with algorithms that kind of automate the dosing a little bit. So the pump I use has a little bit of automation like that. What's amazing to me is that the amount of sugar in our blood at a time is just 1 teaspoon. So out of the 5 liters of blood in your body, you just have 1 teaspoon of sugar, and any tiny deviation in that amount of sugar has enormous health consequences. So if your blood sugar goes a little bit low, so instead of a teaspoon, now you've got, 3/4 of a teaspoon or something, that is enough to kill you. Your brain needs glucose to keep the oxygen flowing. And if your blood sugar goes a little bit low, so instead of a teaspoon, now you've got, 3/4 of a teaspoon or something, that is enough to kill you. Your brain needs glucose to keep the oxygen flowing. And if your blood sugar goes a little bit low, so instead of a teaspoon, now you've got, 3/4 of a teaspoon or something, that is enough to kill you. Your brain needs glucose to keep the oxygen flowing. And so if your blood sugar gets a little bit low, you have very big symptoms, although that kind of goes away if you frequently have low blood sugar, so it becomes harder to feel it. But the symptoms include shaking, faster heart rate. Sometimes hunger is actually a really helpful cue. Sweating, this is an adrenaline response, confusion, dizziness, and the number one killer of people with type 1 diabetes in my age group at least is low blood sugar. Often when you're asleep, if your blood sugar goes too low, say you eat a meal and take insulin and take a nap, then your blood sugar could go low enough that you die in your sleep. So this is something that the continuous glucose monitors are really helping us with, because you can have them send alerts and wake you up or wake a family member up. And then I told you we just have a teaspoon of sugar in our blood, which is such a small amount. But we also have 80 to 120 grams of these more complicated chains of glucose called glycogen. We have 80 to 120 grams in our liver and 3 to 400 grams in our muscle, which has all kinds of interesting implications. For example, when you go running, you tend to have your blood sugar immediately start to drop from using the glucose. Whereas when you do weight training, you actually activate the glycogen in the muscles, which can release the sugar into your blood, and your blood sugar is more likely to increase when you're doing anaerobic exercise like weightlifting, whereas aerobic exercise like running can actually decrease your blood sugar kind of quickly. So knowing that you have these stores, and also when they get depleted, they need to be replenished, is really important. Like one of the times in my life when I had the most trouble with low blood sugars was when I was breastfeeding. I have two kids. And when you're making milk, you can't predict when that's going to happen, but just all of a sudden you have a ton of sugar being slurped out of your system to make the milk. And so that required a lot of really close monitoring and like always having snacks around and stuff. Okay, so what affects blood sugar? You can try to start making a list: exercise, obviously, stress, food with carbohydrates. I mean, this list could just go on and on. And luckily, there's a guy who has written a really great book that I love, and he has this sheet that he calls 42 factors that affect blood glucose. And so this gives you a sense of all the different things you have to know about as a type 1 diabetic to keep this rolling. So that's why it's called the thinking person's disease. Um, Anyway, I won't belabor it, but I will offer you this list, which you can find on the website Diatribe. And one of my favorite things he describes here that's kind of a centerpiece of this lecture is that the carb type, the ratio of fiber to total carbs and sugar to total carbs, and then also liquid versus solid, has a huge impact on how foods affect your blood sugar. So, for example, you'll see I highlighted this chia pudding link because I was looking at the recipe myself. I love eating chia pudding. And chia, almost all the carbohydrates are in the form of fiber, and they do not spike your blood sugar right away at all. So in this case, you got 20 grams of carbs total in the recipe that he puts out here, which has a quarter cup of chia seeds. And 16 of those grams are in the form of fiber. So you don't really need much insulin. He mentions that he takes a unit of insulin to eat that chia pudding, and I do something similar. Or if I eat it before I go for a walk or a run, I don't actually need to take extra insulin. Just the basal insulin I have on board is enough. So anyway, this is a really important point. There has been a trend towards keto diets, or like eating a no carbohydrate diet in order to avoid blood sugar spikes. But I mean, that is kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in my opinion, because if you're having a high fiber carbohydrate, you can end up keeping really nice, smooth blood glucose trends. So here's an example of a plot you see a lot when you're looking at blood sugars, of time versus blood sugar response. And when you eat refined sugars, you get these big spikes. So, and it doesn't have to taste sweet, but certainly sugar's in that category. So is white rice, so is white bread. And by the way, I know lots of type 1 diabetics who have strategies for eating white rice. And they know how to handle the insulin and make it work for them. And especially if you combine it with other foods at the same time, proteins, fats, and fiber, that can really help. For example, in one study I saw they had people drink glucose and eat chia seeds. And if you have the glucose by itself, you get a big blood sugar spike. But if you eat the glucose and the chia at the same time, you avoid the blood sugar spike. So combinations can make a big difference. But here's just some examples of the timing of blood sugar response to foods. Protein, you'll see, it's not that it avoids a blood sugar spike, it's just much slower. So when I eat high protein meals, I keep that in mind, and I can take boluses with my insulin pump where I tell it to wait and like to extend the timing so I don't get a big chunk of insulin all at once, but instead it gets spread out over a couple hours. And that makes a big difference. And that's what your body's doing. And if this interests you, this book that Adam Brown has written, this is the guy whose chia seed pudding recipe I just showed you, is wonderful. And he's got lots of strategies related to food, mindset, exercise, and sleep. Um, so with that, I want to make sure that I bring up Ozempic because it's on everybody's minds this year, right? In fact, Ozempic sales in the last year had such a big impact on Novo Nordisk, the pharmaceutical company in Denmark, that they actually lifted the entire country's GDP, and the economists for Denmark had to make a new category just for Ozempic. And because it's so expensive in the US, you know. So we had this very interesting year of Ozempic. And essentially, I just want to point out that, you know, what Ozempic does is mimic a hormone that makes us feel full. Now, you don't need Ozempic to do that. Fiber is a perfect way to do this. Ozempic is essentially, you know, a pharmaceutical way of replicating what already happens if you eat a high fiber diet. So here's an NPR article that goes into detail about why fiber mimics Ozempic. But if you eat complex carbohydrates and ones that are not easily accessed by human enzymes like fiber, you will end up having is a lot of the same responses that you would get from taking Ozempic, but it's even better because at least it's coordinated with the food that you're eating instead of this 24/7 impact of taking a pharmaceutical. So it's a more biological rhythm. So that brings me back to, you know, what carbohydrates are and what fiber is. And so again, fibers are these longer chains of linked sugars that are not accessible by human enzymes, whereas starch are chains of sugars that are accessible by human enzymes, but will take a bit longer to break down than just a single molecule sugar. When you're looking at a nutrition label, the fiber is parsed out, not with great, you know, molecular detail, but you can at least pull out that, for example, in this piece of white bread, there's 1 gram of fiber that you could subtract from the total carbs. And in this piece of wheat bread, there's 4 grams of fiber that you could subtract from the total carbs. So if you were dosing insulin, so I'm kind of like a knockout, I get to see how much insulin I need in all different situations. But if you're trying to reduce the burden on your body of needing to produce insulin, eating fiber reduces the carb load and makes it easier for your body to absorb the glucose that is coming in. And I just want to point out that this is such a frontier. The carbohydrate composition of all different foods is very poorly studied, and it's completely justified to use the term dark matter to describe the carbohydrate structures that are so understudied. So like in this butternut squash, we know so much about the proteins and vitamins in the food, but for carbohydrates, we just lump it all into this one category when actually there's a lot of different chemical details going on in there. So I think in the next 10 years, it's going to be a really fun time to learn about carbohydrates. Okay, so I just have this diagram here again to show you how the different compositions of food will affect your blood sugar. So again, simpler sugars and carbohydrates will spike your blood sugar more quickly, whereas eating complex carbs and proteins, and especially fiber, will lead to a much slower peak in blood sugar after you're eating. If you're looking to accomplish that even with pasta and rice, they can be healthier as leftovers. If you cook pasta or rice and then put it in the fridge to cool it down and then eat it again as a leftover, some of the starch that's in the food becomes a more resistant starch that slows down the timing that affects your blood sugar. This is also true for potatoes, actually. Um, One measure that we use to describe the impact of a food on our blood sugar is the glycemic index. And so here's some different foods that have, between low and high glycemic index. The high glycemic index at the top has bread and fruit. And then you'll see, down here at the opposite extreme are low carb veggies and beans and lentils. And the recipes Jess has prepared for us today are great low glycemic foods. And here's some low carb vegetables where you can get lots of fiber, but not so much starch that it affects your blood sugar. Maybe the exceptions down here are the potatoes. Now, these glycemic index measures were conducted on small numbers of people. Sometimes these are like little studies of 10 people from the 1970s, and they're just assuming everyone has the same response. When I was younger, I viewed the glycemic index as this like fixed piece of information that would always be true for everybody. But I would also notice that I had really individual responses that were different from the people around me to different foods. We're now really starting to understand that. We now are seeing that you can do personalized nutrition by prediction of glycemic responses. And now that we have these continuous glucose monitors, you can try eating different foods and seeing how it affects your blood sugar. And one amazing result coming out of this is that we often find that the composition of someone's microbiome correlates with how their blood sugar responds to different foods. So this was a study with 1,000 people or so from Israel, and they've launched a personalized nutrition project, which is really interesting. And you can read Aaron Segal and Aaron Elenov's book. They've started a company as well. And they found that, there were some people who would have their blood sugar spike after eating tomatoes, but for other people, the tomatoes didn't spike their blood sugar and bananas did. And this all correlates with the microbiome, and it's still something we're putting a lot of energy into figuring out. I would not say we know the answers yet, but this is a frontier in nutrition. I still think we know enough to make wise choices. As far as eating low glycemic foods, on average, a lot of the foods we just described are going to work for most people. So as I've mentioned, fiber degradation is not accessible by human enzymes, but different microbes carry enzymes that specifically can degrade particular types of fiber. And so this is an active area of research also in my lab, where we're trying to figure out which microbes are good at breaking down which fibers. And I won't belabor it. I'm going to wrap it up so we can hear from Jess. But as you've heard me say before, dietary fibers are broken down by our gut bacteria, and they produce healthy molecules that feed the cells lining our intestine and have all these impacts, not just glucose spikes reduction, but reductions in obesity, heart disease, increases in nutrient absorption, better immune responses. So that includes better responses to cancer immunotherapy, better responses to vaccines, and so on. I'm starting to see fiber have its moment in the news. We're always hearing about how we should eat enough protein, but it's really fiber that's the nutrient that we're missing. In this article in the New York Times, they do a good job of describing 12 fiber-filled foods, and they don't have to be expensive. Frozen berries and dried legumes are great deals and a great source of fiber. Today, Jess has recipes with both beans and lentils, which I think are going to be great. And it doesn't necessarily matter which fiber you choose. That's the main message from some of these microbiome studies where we compare specific fiber type interventions. Really, any fiber is helpful. And so we're doing some fiber interventions here at UCI. I have one coming up in the next couple weeks with a 2-week fiber intervention, and I'm inviting you. Here's my email address if anybody would like to join. Here are my 5 key takeaways that you can find on the website, and you guys can read, but feel free to have a look at that on the website too. I'd like to acknowledge my lab. Here we are on Catalina Island, and I have a wonderful team of graduate students and postdocs doing all this research with me. And so I have a really fun year ahead. Here's the webinars we've got planned all year. And if you go to this website, you can find the recipes too. So I want to turn it over to Jess. Today's recipes include black bean oatmeal nut truffles, and crunchy Thai spiced cashew quinoa salad with lentil kebabs. And lentils are a wonderful low glycemic index food with nearly half of their carbohydrates in the form of fiber. And if you go on the website to the past webinars section down at the bottom, you should find a link with the recipes. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing so that Jess has a chance here.
There are a couple questions for you too, though.
Oh, great. I will have a look.
There we go. Okay. So I'm going to make two things today. And so the first thing I'm going to show you is the lentil kebab. I'm going to turn this down, sorry. There we go. So for the lentil kebab, we are going to use cooked lentils. You can use cooked lentils or you can use soaked lentils. So it's up to you which one you want to use. I just cooked these, but you can soak them. Soaking them might be better for you if you feel like you have a hard time digesting lentils or carbs like that, complex carbs like this. And so you can soak them and do that. I'm going to give myself a little bit more room. So for the lentil kebab, we're going to do red lentils, onion, and lemongrass. So you can kind of do this any way or shape that you want, in the sense that you get to kind of play around with the flavors. So I have a food processor. You're going to ask me, do I need a food processor? You can use a blender. This is the part that I need you to blend. It's the onions and the garlic that you really want to kind of blend together so that they get mixed. Red lentils, when you cook them, turn pretty mushy, so you don't really have to worry too much about it. So if you can find a way to maybe grate your onion or use the garlic press for the garlic, you can probably get the same consistency. The other things we're going to add in here are lemongrass, and I want to show you. We live in Southern California. We're lucky. We have access to a lot of great ingredients, including lemongrass that is frozen and already chopped up. So if you go to any Vietnamese supermarket or like a 99 Ranch, I don't believe any of the Korean markets would have it, maybe H Mart. You can buy it pre-chopped up and you can just dump it in then. If you want to use the fresh one, you can, and I would suggest you use a microplane and just grate it on. I've got a little bit of chickpea flour, it's our garbanzo bean flour, and that you can buy it from Bob's Red Mill. You just want something that can absorb extra liquid. So if you have oat flour, that would work as well. I've got a little bit of flaxseed meal, because that's going to hold everything together for us too, and then our seasoning. So I've got a little bit of cumin, coriander, garlic, and salt. And the recipe does call for cilantro, so if you have any, add it in. I ran out today, so I'm going to let this go. And I'm not going to add any extra liquid in there. There's enough liquid from what you added or cooked with the lentils that it'll blend all together really nicely. And that's it. So I have to say that this is an inspiration from Dr. Parekh's mom. Dr. Namisha Parekh's mom makes amazing Jain food. So Jain is it's a special way of eating. They don't use onion and garlic, which she wouldn't have used this onion and garlic. But I went to a party of theirs once, and they had what they called a cutlet. And it was a lentil cutlet, and it tasted like meat. And they deep fried it, so it was extra good. But it's that same idea of how can I take a product like lentils or tofu and give it that same kind of feel as meat. One way around it, or one way to do that, is to actually flavor it, season it correctly. So the seasoning in here makes it taste like kind of like a kebab because you've got the different types of ingredients, the cumin, the coriander, and then I added the lemongrass. So now you're gonna form this into patties. You can, as long as you can pick it up with your hand and go around in a circle, you're good to go. So I'm just gonna form them. You can form them in any shape that you want, doesn't matter. And you can pan fry them or you can put them in the oven. I like putting them in the oven just because it's a little bit more firm that way. So what you're doing right now when you're cooking it is you're removing the extra liquid that's inside of it. If you want it nice and soft, then you wouldn't cook it for as long. If you want a kebab that has a little bit more of like a bite to it, then you can put it in for longer. So it's really what kind of texture you're looking for. If you feel like this is too soft for you to work with, you can always add more of the chickpea flour too. These freeze really, really well. So then you can serve them on anything. You can serve them with rice, you can serve them with a salad, which is what we're gonna be doing today. But what I did was I added a little bit of lemongrass to make it a different flavor. All right. So I'm gonna take these and I'm gonna put them in the oven. All right. So while those are cooking, let's make our salad. So I've got a salad dressing that we're gonna make. Pretty simple. For the salad dressing, we're gonna use almond or sunflower, nut butter, any kind of butter that you have. I have almond butter today. Unsweetened, unsalted. Because guess what? You can add all of those things in by yourself. We can control the sugar and the salt. I have to say I've learned a lot about diabetes from Dr. Katrine Whiteson, and my dad is also diabetic, and he is one of those people, I will say, and if you ever want, you can reach out to me if you're newly diabetic or pre-diabetic. My dad has actually become healthier since his diagnosis. It was almost like getting diagnosed with diabetes was a wake-up call. And now he has the most amazing diet. He exercises almost every day, and it's a transformation. So he definitely does watch what he eats, but it's really interesting how change can be positive, something can be good. So I need 5 tablespoons of almond butter, 2. And if you noticed, I store these upside down. The oil tends to sit at the top, and so you want to make sure that the oil and the butter mix. And so I usually store these upside down so that the oil and butter can mix. Yeah. And one more after this. And then I need some ginger. And if you're not doing this in a blender, you can use like a microplane. Well, what you can do is you can take your piece of ginger. If you haven't seen this before, just grab a spoon to peel it. So you can just go around it and then peel it that way. Not that there's anything wrong with the peel. So if your ginger is nice and clean, go ahead. You can just put the whole thing in there. And this is when I like to say, I've been doing this a lot recently. Anything that has ginger root in it, I've just been sticking turmeric in as well. And if I stick the turmeric in, then I'm gonna stick in the pepper. But if you're ever trying to find a way to use fresh turmeric, try using it whenever you're using ginger. All right. This dressing you can freeze too, so you don't, it might not stay in the refrigerator for as long as if you kept it in the... All right, now 3 cloves of garlic. I'm just gonna give it a good push. Oops. You can add more or less depending on what you like for garlic. And one more. Okay, and now we need soy sauce or tamari, 2 to 3 tablespoons. I'm gonna do 2.5. Not 3, but 2.5. And then I need something sweet. So I'm gonna use date syrup. You can use, woo, I took off the whole lid. You can use date syrup or you can use maple syrup, honey, and I want 1 tablespoon. And then a little bit of rice vinegar. And I like adding rice vinegar into most, as the vinegar for most Asian salad dressings. I just feel like it gives it a nice flavor. A little bit of sesame oil. And again, sesame oil comes in 2 different forms if you're shopping at like 99 Ranch. There's a refined and an unrefined. So just be careful what you're buying. All right, and then a lime. So for the lime, we want to give it a good roll. And again, if it doesn't want to roll and you can't seem to get the juice out of it, put it in your microwave. 20-second intervals. Juice. So one of the things people will ask me a lot of times is, what's the sugar substitute? What do I use to substitute sugar? And my answer has been this. Just reduce the amount of sugar you're using, first of all, is a good start. And then the other thing is there are products out there, but what I don't want you to do is think that you can use them in the same amount as regular sugar. I need you to actually change your taste buds a little bit. Our food is too sweet. So if I introduce you to a sugar substitute that works well, you end up kind of still having that same flavor, that same need for sweetness. So what I'd actually like you to do is reduce your need for that sweetness, and then I would introduce you to the product. And that product, I think you've heard me talk about it a couple times, is allulose. So allulose is a great sugar substitute for the kitchen. It bakes really well, it caramelizes, and it works like sugar. It's amazing. It's a little bit more expensive though, but Splenda has started to make it and you can buy it on Amazon. So if you are interested in baking and you want a good sugar substitute, allulose is the one. But again, start by just cutting down on the amount of sugar first so that you don't need that sweetness. Right, so dressing, ready to go. All right, so there's our dressing. Nice and creamy. Looks great. Oops, excuse me. And now let's build our salad. So I really wanted to show everyone the salad because I usually make salads that you can't keep. I mean, in the sense that you make a salad and you need to eat it right away. How do I make a salad that I can actually freeze? Cabbage freezes. Oops. So cabbage freezes really well. So you can actually make slaw type recipes that don't have mayonnaise in them. As long as they don't have mayonnaise in them, you're good to go. So I only need 1 cup. So when you buy a head of cabbage, it's so hard these days to know what size. But again, you can make a lot of the salad and just have it ready to go. So I'm gonna cut this into quarters and then you can shred it. You can actually take a box grater to it, or I like to just practice knife skills. So again, pinch your blade, claw your fingers, and then push forward. And then in an area that's too high, my knife isn't big enough, what I'll do is I'll just remove some of them. And then I can go back in later. So when you think about things that you freeze, what you want to think about is how much water content is in that item. There's a lot of water in it. It doesn't mean that you can't freeze it, but what kind of structure will it give you after you defrost it? For some reason, cabbage has the ability to actually hold its structure pretty well even after freezing it. So I'm going to put 1 cup of white cabbage, 1 cup of red, and you could do all red cabbage. I know a lot of people love their red cabbage, which is great, because then you're getting all those colors, those antioxidants into your diet too. And you can buy all of this pre-shredded for you too. So you don't even need to do this. You could just grab a bag of slaw mix and you could have the same effect. All right. And then we also have, I'm gonna bring everything over here. I have some carrots, 2 shredded carrots that go in there, some scallions. So I do this on purpose. My scallions are always dirty, okay? Before I chop them, I'll switch knives, don't worry. I'm gonna take off the bottoms first. You can regrow these if you want. You can stick them in a little bit of water and they will pop right back up. I'm gonna cut through the middle of each of them, okay? What that does is it exposes the dirt that might be hanging out in the middle. Now I'm gonna claw my hand and chop. Some people think that the bottom parts are a little bit too strong, if they're a little bit too like spicy for you. Keep them in your refrigerator and cook with them like you would cook onion. If you're like on a low FODMAP diet, like you can definitely use green onions, sorry. And then the white part, I like all of it, but you can use the parts that you want. But like I said, dirty. Bowl of water, put it right in there, okay, with the red cabbage, and give it a good swirl. Keep mixing, 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 and then you can go in, and the dirt will actually go to the bottom, and the scallions or the green onions float right to the top. So now I can take all my green onions, put it right in there. Just like that. All right. And then we have a red bell pepper. And you can slice it or dice it. It's up to you. Really, whatever way you like your salad. I'm going to take off this end. And you can still use all of that. It just makes cutting it sometimes a little bit easier. But remember, cut on the inside because it's not slippery. The outside is slippery. I'm making sticks first and then I'm going to dice it. Stack them all up. Out of all the products that go into this salad, the things that would not freeze as well are the bell pepper and the cucumber. Even bell pepper is pretty forgiving if it's not too juicy. Again, the water, but the cucumbers don't freeze very well. So if you want, skip out on the cucumbers if you're gonna add this inside. But I'm just gonna quarter it, fan them out, and dice. you can tell you can really do anything that you want with this salad just based on what you have in your refrigerator. It does call for a red onion too, so you can add your red onion in there. But for time's sake, because I want to show you dessert, let's toss this salad together. So I've got a little bit of quinoa too, and some edamame, and then my salad dressing. Oops. So it's a very, very pretty salad, and it's nice and crunchy because of all the greens. Again, if you want to add cilantro, this is a dish that definitely could call for it. I just couldn't get any. Okay. There we go. So think of all that fiber you're creating, like Dr. Katrine Whiteson was talking about. It really is, how do you create, I was trying to explain it to my kids the other day. I'm creating like a net, and that net is just holding everything, holding all the stuff for me and just letting it slowly get through, not too fast, so that I can enjoy all the nutrients that I'm eating. And all the bad stuff too. All right, so there you go. There's your crunch salad, really good. And then I'll grab the kebabs as soon as I'm done showing you dessert. So dessert, fun. You know that I love ways to use black beans 10 times over. Like, how can we make a black bean into something good? So this is one of those. And I'm gonna introduce, there are a lot of people who don't know about dates. Dates are amazing. They're really sweet, and it's like eating candy, but it's a natural product. So what you do is you can take dates, soak them, and then you have date water. Don't throw that away, because you might need it to hold everything together. So what I have are my dates in here, and I'm gonna puree them. All right. And then I'm gonna push that down a little. Ay. I'm gonna do it one more time. Nice. Now, oats, toasted oats, makes a huge difference. If you are an oat eater, try toasting your oats in the oven, or if you want, you can also toast things in the microwave. In like 1 minute intervals. So I'm gonna mix that all up. Black beans. You can cook them yourself, easily find unsalted canned black beans even, and you're gonna add that in as well. And this is the best part, raw cacao. I'm not gonna cook it, so I'm gonna get all the healthy benefits from it, including fiber. Did you know? I'm going to push it down a couple more times. And if it looks a little dry, this is when you can use a little bit of that reserved date water. Now, I have some like toasted nuts that I have ready to go. You can just go in, again, same like the kebab. Roll them in your hand, just like that. Toss them in the nuts, okay? And then you've got a truffle ready to go. And think, that's all black beans and oats in there. There you go. So you can keep asking questions. I'm gonna keep making these right now. Katrine, if you're on, go for it if you need to say anything.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm really enjoying this. I couldn't agree with you more about how a big part of why fiber is healthy is that it forms this net, like a gel that just will go through your digestive tract and help slow the release of nutrients and help you absorb them at a reasonable pace, help you feeling full. There's really a lot of benefits to having that gel from the fiber um, as part of your digestion. And so recently, I've just been really noticing that when you soak chia seeds, you see that gel, and it comes from having a good mixture of soluble and insoluble fiber, which is really going to happen. Like the texture of that black bean truffle mix when you blend it. I actually made this recipe myself a couple nights ago.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and my son loved it. We both really liked it. Um,
Yay.
I used a different kind of dates, and I was wondering if I had reduced the sweetness too much. Although I agree with you that we need a bit of a frame shift. Like you don't need all that sweetness all the time.
So
Uh,
there's I can't say it. There's medjool, and then
yeah,
the medjool tends to be sweeter. So use the
I
other
see.
one if you want, the NEGLET one. But medjools tend to be a little bit sweeter than the other ones.
I see. So maybe we
Yes.
need to use more. I was using, I think they're called Degel. I don't know how to pronounce it. Do
Oh yeah.
you
And then
know?
there's the neglect. I can never say those
Oh,
right either.
yes.
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yep.
Well, that's
But
interesting to know. So I think
yep.
they came out less sweet because of that. And so what I did was I put a little bit of cinnamon and powdered sugar on top, and that
Oh,
really
nice.
was good.
Yep. Remember, cinnamon's your best friend when you can't have too much sugar. It really makes a difference just starting to use a little bit of cinnamon in substitute for sugar. And if you are a baker, you can go ahead and eliminate about a third of most sugar content on online recipes and get away with it. So start playing around with it. You'll be surprised. Thank you, everyone. Sorry for keeping you over too. Happy New Year, and we'll see you next month. Thank you. Bye.